The origin story, or how to turn a bad childhood into a global empire. Hey guys, tonight let's ease into the surprisingly effective yet utterly brutal management style of a man who conquered more land than anyone else in history, Genghis Khan. Forget your corporate retreats and leadership seminars. Genghis Khan ran his empire like a terrifying, highly efficient, and slightly unhinged startup. A startup where HR meetings often ended with a lot of arrows, and team building involved pillaging entire cities. So, before you get too comfortable, maybe take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely find my historical ramblings a soothing alternative to, well, whatever existential dread is currently keeping you awake. And do let me know in the comments where you're drifting off from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore how a man born in a goat hair tent with a name that literally means universal ruler became the ultimate disruptive force of the 13th century. And trust me, his business practices would make even the most ruthless venture capitalist blush. Or, run screaming. First, let's talk about his networking strategy. In the medieval village, wedding invitations spread by gossip. For Genghis Khan, news of his arrival spread by, mass panic and the scent of burning cities. There were no gilded parchments, no wax seals, just the chilling whispers of "the Mongols are coming." A day later, it reached the local lord, who told the duke, who told the king, who told literally everyone he passed while frantically packing his gold, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the pigeons knew someone was getting conquered. Now, let's be clear. Temujin, the future Genghis Khan, didn't exactly have a privileged upbringing. His childhood was less born with a silver spoon and more born with a blood clot in his fist while being chased by rival tribes across a freezing steppe. Think less noble heir and more medieval street urchin with a very, very strong will to survive. He was born around 1162, give or take a decade or two, because let's face it, keeping detailed birth records wasn't exactly a top priority when you were busy trying not to get murdered by your neighbors. His father, Yasugaya, was a minor chieftain, which in the grand scheme of the Mongolian steppe meant he had slightly more goats than the next guy and was marginally less likely to be ambushed on Tuesdays. But even chieftain status was fleeting. Yasugaya was poisoned by a rival Tatar tribe when Temujin was just a boy, probably around 9 years old. This wasn't some grand political assassination. It was more like a particularly rude case of food poisoning after a friendly feast. "Oh, this kumis tastes metallic. Is that arsenic?" And poof, Dad's gone. This left Temujin, his mother, Hoylan, and his younger siblings completely vulnerable. His father's former clan, being the epitome of compassionate medieval neighbors, immediately abandoned them. "Oh, you're a widow and a bunch of children? We're good, thanks. Wouldn't want to carry any extra baggage, especially if that baggage might attract more angry Tartars. Toodaloo!" They stripped the family of their livestock and left them to starve. It was basically the 12th century equivalent of being fired from your family business and then having your car repossessed by your own relatives. Charming. So young Temujin found himself plunged into a brutal school of hard knocks. Survival was a daily, often minute-by-minute struggle. They lived by hunting marmots and fishing in the rivers. Now, hunting marmots might sound quaint, but try doing it with a handmade bow and arrow while simultaneously dodging hungry wolves, frostbite, and the occasional raiding party. It builds character, they say. It also builds a deep-seated appreciation for not starving to death. This period was crucial for shaping Temujin's unique leadership philosophy. He learned several vital lessons that would eventually propel him to global dominance. Lesson 1. Trust absolutely no one outside your immediate blood-sworn circle. Lesson 2. Loyalty, once given, is non-negotiable. Betrayal? That was punishable by, well, extreme and creative forms of dismemberment. Lesson 3. Resources are everything, and if you don't have them, you take them. Simple economics, really, just with more violence. He even had a dramatic sibling rivalry moment that foreshadowed his future ruthlessness. His half-brother, Bektor, was apparently a bit of a jerk, often stealing food from Temujin and his full brother, Kassar. One day, fed up with Bektor's antics, Temujin and Kassar ambushed and killed him. Now, this wasn't just a squabble over a piece of dried meat. This was a statement. I will not tolerate internal dissent, even from my own family. And also, don't touch my dinner. It showed a chilling pragmatism, a willingness to eliminate obstacles no matter how close they were. Most family therapists would probably recommend a different approach. This single act, a fratricide committed by a desperate teenager, sent a clear message to his family. Temujin was not to be trifled with. He was the new patriarch, even if he was just barely old enough to shave his patchy adolescent beard. The steppes, you see, didn't care for emotional baggage or safe spaces. They cared about strength, cunning, and the ability to keep your marmot supply secure. His early life was a continuous cycle of alliances, betrayals, and desperate bids for survival. He was captured multiple times, once famously escaping by hiding in a river and holding on to a floating log, breathing through reeds. This wasn't some heroic cinematic escape. This was dirty, desperate, and probably involved a lot of mosquitoes. But it cemented his reputation as someone who simply refused to die. A valuable trait when your career path involves conquering half the known world. Eventually, he formed a crucial alliance with Togrul, Khan of the Karaites, who was essentially his father's blood brother. This was his first big break, a chance to gain power and protection. Togrul became a mentor figure, a kind of grizzled, wise, and slightly unpredictable corporate sponsor. Temujin learned the ropes of steppe politics, raiding strategies, and how to tell the difference between genuine loyalty and someone just trying to steal your horses. But of course, in the cutthroat world of nomadic tribal politics, even family alliances were temporary. Togrul eventually betrayed Temujin, a move that, in retrospect, was a terrible business decision. You simply do not cross a man who survived being abandoned by his clan, poisoning attempts, and hiding in a river from his own brother. That's just basic Genghis Khan 101, a course a lot of people failed, usually posthumously. This betrayal, like all the others, only hardened Temujin's resolve. He learned that the only person he could truly rely on was himself, and the only way to secure peace was to eliminate all rivals, permanently.
not with a stern talking to or a strongly worded memo, but with overwhelming force and a complete restructuring of the competitive landscape. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preventing anyone else from ever suffering the indignities he had endured, or perhaps just enjoying the sheer power of it all. Who's to say? So by the time he became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, he wasn't just a skilled warrior, he was a product of his environment, a master of strategic pragmatism, forged in the crucible of constant threat and profound loss. Every betrayal, every hardship, every cold, hungry night under the vast Mongolian sky served as a learning experience, a professional development opportunity that would, quite literally, shape the world. His early life provided the blueprint for his later conquests, a ruthless dedication to meritocracy, an insistence on absolute loyalty, a brutal efficiency in logistics, and a communication strategy based on, well, mostly terror. He proved that even from the most humble and terrifying beginnings, you could build an empire. You just had to be willing to break a lot of eggs, and probably a lot of people. Next time, as we delve into the surprising corporate structure of the Mongol Empire, and how Genghis Khan turned a bunch of squabbling nomads into the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen. You might even pick up a few tips for your next team building exercise. Probably not.
The meritocracy of the steppe. You're only as good as your last raid. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the surprisingly effective and often terrifying business models of the past. Last time, we eased into the origin story of Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, learning how a particularly rough childhood involving poisoned fathers, abandoned families, and sibling disputes over stolen fish taught him some rather unconventional leadership lessons. Tonight, we're going to dive into the core of his management philosophy, a ruthless, brutal, yet undeniably effective meritocracy. Forget your modern corporate ladder. In the Mongol Empire, your promotion depended not on who your dad knew, but on how many cities you sacked and how enthusiastically you followed orders. Let's start with a concept utterly alien to medieval Europe, the absence of gentlemen in the ranks. In the armies of kings and dukes, command was often determined by noble birth. You might be a terrible strategist, prone to losing battles, and have a hygiene routine that offended even pigs, but if you had a fancy title and a family crest, you were in charge. Now, imagine bringing that ethos to a nomadic horde whose very existence depended on brutal efficiency. It simply wouldn't work. And Genghis Khan knew it. He had, after all, seen what happens when your own clan abandons you because they think you're a liability. He wasn't about to build an empire on inherited ineptitude. His army was a stark contrast. There were no inherited titles among his commanders, not in the European sense. Your position depended purely on proven skill, demonstrated bravery, and crucially, unwavering loyalty. Take Subutai, for example. He started as a common soldier, the son of a blacksmith, yet he became one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, conquering more territory than many kings. Or Jebe, a former enemy warrior who had once shot Genghis Khan's horse during a battle. Instead of executing him, Genghis Khan admired his skill and courage, recruited him, and elevated him to a top commander. Imagine that in a modern office. You tried to sabotage my last project, but I like your initiative, so you're promoted to head of sales. It was revolutionary and slightly terrifying.
This wasn't some soft, modern, everybody gets a trophy approach to team building. This was a you perform or you die, and maybe your whole unit dies too system. His philosophy was simple. If you were good at fighting, if you were brave, if you were loyal, you rose through the ranks. If you were lazy, incompetent, or, heaven forbid, disloyal, your career path ended rather abruptly, usually with a very sharp blade. This approach meant that every single man in the Mongol army, from the lowest foot soldier to the highest general, had to constantly prove their worth. There was no resting on your laurels, no coasting to retirement. The only laurels were made of skulls, and you had to keep adding to them. This brings us to Genghis Khan's infamous work ethic policy. Remember the struggles of the early Jamestown colonists we discussed previously, where a significant portion of gentlemen settlers famously refused to perform manual labor, considering it beneath their station, and nearly starved the entire colony to death? Well, Genghis Khan had no such problems. His policy was brutally clear. He that will not work shall not eat. And in the Mongol context, not eat often quickly escalated to not live. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a promise. Every soldier, regardless of their past status, participated in the hard labor of the Omi. This meant hunting for food, moving camp, which involved dismantling and re-erecting entire yurts daily, scouting, and of course, fighting. There were no designated non-combat roles for those with delicate sensibilities. Everyone pulled their weight, and then some. Try to imagine explaining work-life balance or employee engagement surveys to a Mongol general. He'd probably just stare at you blankly, then ask if you were suggesting you had too much life and not enough work before assigning you to the front lines of the next siege. The only engagement they cared about was engaging the enemy. This rigorous discipline extended to punishments, which formed the cornerstone of their HR policy. The Mongol army operated on a system of absolute, unwavering obedience. Orders were to be followed without question, and if they weren't, well, that's where things got truly interesting. If a soldier deserted, or if a small unit failed in their duty, it wasn't just that individual or group who paid the price. Often the entire unit, sometimes even the entire 1,000-man contingent they belonged to, would face collective punishment. This could range from severe beatings to mass execution.
This low-energy voice, combined with the meritocratic system, allowed for incredible innovation in military tactics. Unlike many static European armies of the time, the Mongols were masters of adaptability. They didn't just rely on cavalry charges, they learned and perfected siege warfare, often by forcing conquered engineers and artisans to build and operate siege engines for them. Oh, you built a lovely city wall? Great! Now help us tear down your neighbors. They employed sophisticated, feigned retreats, drawing out unsuspecting enemies before turning to surround and annihilate them. They mastered flanking maneuvers, encirclement, and combined arms tactics long before modern military academies were even a twinkle in a general's eye. Their agile methodology, as we might call it today, was ruthless and constantly evolving. They were never afraid to pivot, usually into your city. They learned from every battle, incorporated new ideas and technologies from the cultures they encountered, and always sought to improve their methods. It was a terrifyingly efficient learning organization with a very high attrition rate for those who failed to grasp the new concepts. They didn't have brainstorming sessions in a comfy conference room. They had battlefield debriefs that determined whether you lived to fight another day. This relentless pursuit of effectiveness, born from the harsh realities of Temujin's youth, cemented his military dominance. He didn't care about noble bloodlines or social niceties. He cared about results. He built an army that was lean, mobile, adaptable, and utterly terrifying in its discipline and cohesion. A true meritocracy where performance was the only metric that mattered. In essence, Genghis Khan proved that you could unite disparate, squabbling nomadic tribes into the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen, not through diplomacy or shared ideology, but through a shared commitment to efficiency, a brutal system of rewards and punishments, and an unwavering focus on the core objective, conquest. It certainly put an end to petty office politics, though it introduced a whole new set of performance anxieties. Next time, we'll delve into the Mongols' surprising supply chain management and logistics, how they fed an army on the move, and why their mobile feast was far more terrifying than any medieval banquet. You might even rethink your next camping trip.
Logistics and supply chain management, the mobile feast, and the problem with picky eaters. Welcome back. Tonight, we're tackling something arguably even more crucial and certainly less glamorous than battlefield heroics, logistics, because an army, no matter how disciplined or terrifying, runs on its stomach. And the Mongol approach to feeding hundreds of thousands of fighting men across vast, desolate landscapes was as ingenious as it was, well, deeply uncomfortable for everyone else involved. Forget modern military supply chains with their carefully coordinated truck convoys, helicopter drops, and pre-packaged MREs that vaguely resemble food. The Mongols had a bring-your-own-meal policy, or more accurately, a bring-your-own-live-meal policy. Their primary food source wasn't hauled behind them in wagons, it was galloping underneath them. We're talking about horses, of course. While horses were primarily for transport and combat, in a pinch they were also a mobile protein source, and, for the truly desperate, a convenient, if somewhat unwilling, blood bank. It wasn't pretty, but it was incredibly effective. You simply bled a horse, drank the blood for sustenance, and kept riding. Try that with your corporate expense account. Their diet was simple, but self-sustaining. Dried meat, often pounded into a powder and mixed with water for a quick, portable meal, what we might call early MREs, or Mongol ready-to-eat. And then there was kumis, the fermented mare's milk. Imagine a slightly alcoholic, tangy, effervescent yogurt drink. It was nutritious, hydrating, and, after a few bowls, probably made you forget that you hadn't seen a vegetable in weeks. This self-sufficiency was revolutionary. Unlike European armies, who often bogged themselves down with massive baggage trains full of food, siege equipment, and even fine dining ware, the Mongols embraced a minimalist ethos that would make even the most ascetic Silicon Valley CEO blush. They carried minimal personal gear, focusing entirely on what was essential for survival and combat. This extreme efficiency allowed them to cover vast distances at incredible speed, often taking their enemies completely by surprise. Their horses weren't just animals,
they were an integral part of their logistics solution. Each warrior typically had several mounts, allowing them to switch to fresh horses mid-ride and cover over 100 miles a day. This wasn't just fast, it was warp speed for the 13th century. Imagine trying to explain this to a European general whose army moved at the pace of its slowest ox cart. Oh, you want to get to the next city before winter? Just ride until your horses drop, then switch to the next one. And don't forget to pack your dried meat. It's simply efficient resource allocation. The Mongols perfected travel packing long before Pinterest, Instagram, or any concept of glamping existed. Their version of glamping involved a yurt and the lingering scent of horse. But let's be honest, even the most efficient self-catering army needs more than dried meat and fermented milk. And this is where the Mongols' supply chain management truly became unique and utterly devastating for everyone else. Their policy was simple. When you conquer a new territory, that territory is now responsible for supplying you. This was not a subtle request. It was a demand backed by an army that rarely lost. The Mongols would demand tribute in the form of grain, livestock, textiles, and crucially, skilled labor. The impact on local populations was catastrophic. Imagine being a peasant who has just survived a Mongol invasion only to have them set up camp in your fields and demand every last ounce of your harvest and every one of your sheep. Their local sourcing policy was, let's say, aggressive. It involved taking everything you owned, and if you resisted, well, you quickly became part of the logistical problem that was solved by simply eliminating you. The feast in conquered cities wasn't shared. It was a one-sided consumption event where the Mongols ate and everyone else starved. This wasn't just about feeding the army, it was a deliberate strategy to weaken the conquered populations, preventing any future rebellions. A truly effective, if horrifying, method of resource control. The Mongols also displayed remarkable adaptability to different environments, a key aspect of their operational flexibility. While they were masters of steppe warfare, they quickly learned to operate in diverse terrains. In China, they adapted to siege warfare, forcing captured engineers and artisans to build and operate catapults and trebuchets. Oh, you built a lovely city wall? Fantastic! Now, using your own engineering genius, help us tear down your neighbors. In Persia, they learned about irrigation systems, which, while beneficial for the long-term sustainability of the land, and thus future tribute collection, were first used to their military advantage. Their pragmatism was boundless. If it breathed, it was a potential food source. If it stood still and had walls, it was a target to be overcome. If it had useful knowledge, it was a resource to be exploited. This wasn't about ethical sourcing or sustainable practices. It was about victory and survival. They absorbed knowledge, technology, and even administrative techniques from the very civilizations they shattered. This ability to learn, adapt, and integrate new ideas, often violently, was a significant factor in their long-term success. They were early adopters of, well, everything, as long as it helped them conquer more effectively. The contrast with their European counterparts couldn't be starker. European armies were often bogged down by heavy armor, complicated supply lines, and a rigid class structure that prioritized noble birth over strategic genius. The Mongols, on the other hand, were a lean, mean, fighting machine, unburdened by unnecessary baggage, tradition, or frankly conscience when it came to securing resources. Their logistical system was a marvel of brutal efficiency, enabling them to move faster, hit harder, and sustain themselves in ways that utterly baffled and terrified their enemies. So, the next time you complain about your company's supply chain issues or your MREs, spare a thought for the Mongol army. They perfected a logistical system that was both revolutionary and utterly merciless. They proved that you don't need fancy infrastructure or a vast network of friendly suppliers when you have enough horses, enough dried meat, and a willingness to simply take whatever you need from whomever happens to be in your way. It was a masterclass in extreme lean manufacturing, where the waste was usually your entire village.
Communication strategies, whispers, arrows, and the power of fear. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to dissect one of the most potent, yet least understood weapons in Genghis Khan's arsenal, his communication strategy. Because while a well-fed army, disciplined army, is essential, an army that can break the enemy's will before battle even begins is truly unstoppable. And the Mongols were masters of this particular art form, using everything from incredibly efficient postal systems to, well, strategically placed piles of human remains to get their message across. Let's start with information dissemination, a concept the Mongols revolutionized long before the internet or even carrier pigeons had a reliable 4G connection. While news in medieval Europe crawled at the pace of gossip, traveling from a well to a baker, then to a miller, then to a midwife who told literally everyone, the Mongols had the yam. This wasn't some quaint little village delivery service. It was a highly organized, brutally efficient postal relay system that spanned their entire vast empire. Imagine a network of post houses, spaced a day's ride apart, stocked with fresh horses and riders ready to leap onto a new mount and carry messages at breakneck speed across thousands of miles. Orders from Genghis Khan could travel from Mongolia to the Black Sea faster than many European kings could send a message across their own small kingdoms. This wasn't just fast, it was, for the 13th century, practically instantaneous. Why send a raven when you can send 1,000 horsemen who will arrive before your raven has even landed? It truly cut down on lag time. This incredible speed of communication wasn't just for military orders, it was a psychological weapon. News of Mongol victories, their devastating tactics, and their relentless advance traveled much faster than the Mongol armies themselves could sometimes march. This created an atmosphere of pervasive fear, a creeping dread that preceded their arrival. Cities would hear tales of destruction weeks, sometimes months, before a single Mongol scout appeared on the horizon. This wasn't just effective, it was a medieval masterclass in viral marketing, powered by panic.
Which brings us to their primary communication tool, psychological warfare. The Mongols perfected the art of preempted terror to induce surrender. Their message was simple, direct, and non-negotiable. Submit immediately and pay tribute, or resist and face absolute, total annihilation. And they had a very compelling track record to back up their claims. They didn't need focus groups to test their marketing. The screams of the recently conquered were feedback enough. The stories, often deliberately exaggerated by the Mongols themselves, were horrifying. Tales of entire cities being razed, populations slaughtered en masse, and the infamous pyramids of skulls left as grim monuments to resistance.
These weren't just random acts of violence, they were carefully calculated acts of communication. When a city heard that their neighbor had been utterly wiped from the map, leaving nothing but bones and rubble, the choice to surrender became very clear. It was an offer you truly couldn't refuse, because the alternative was unthinkable. The psychological impact of knowing what awaited resistance often meant cities, even fortified ones, would open their gates without a fight. This saved the Mongols time, resources, and reduced casualties for their own side, a very efficient, if morally reprehensible, form of negotiation. Their diplomacy was equally direct. Mongol envoys were not soft-spoken diplomats carrying olive branches. They were stern, unyielding messengers delivering ultimatums. They would demand total submission, tribute, and military assistance from the target kingdom. Any defiance, any disrespect shown to these envoys was considered an insult to Genghis Khan himself, and the consequences were severe. Famously, when the Khwarezmian Shah killed a Mongol trade envoy, it sparked one of the most brutal Mongol campaigns of all time. You simply do not cut off the heads of Mongol ambassadors, unless you want the Mongols to come and remove a great many more heads from your kingdom. Their negotiating style was very direct. No need for complex spreadsheets or PowerPoint presentations, just a lot of very sharp swords and a long, bloody history.
Beyond the terror, the Mongols also excelled at intelligence gathering. Before any major campaign, they would send out highly skilled scouts to gather detailed information about the enemy's strength, defenses, troop movements, and even internal political divisions. They used local guides and defectors to learn the terrain and the weaknesses of their adversaries. This data-driven decision-making was crucial to their success. The data was usually along the lines of how many defenders are there and how terrified are they. They knew the importance of knowing your enemy, their strengths, and more importantly, their weaknesses. They were meticulous in their planning, often surprising enemies not just with their speed, but with their uncanny knowledge of the local landscape and political climate. In essence, the Mongols transformed communication into a weapon of war. The Yam ensured rapid command and control across their vast empire. Their psychological warfare, though brutal, minimized costly sieges and battles by inducing preemptive surrender. And their precise intelligence gathering eliminated many unknowns, giving them a significant advantage on the battlefield. Their message was loud, clear, and delivered with overwhelming force. Resistance is futile, submission is preferable. So, the next time you get a particularly passive-aggressive email at work or see a terrifyingly effective viral marketing campaign, spare a thought for the Mongols. They perfected the art of communication that was both efficient and utterly chilling. They proved that sometimes the message isn't just in the words, but in the undeniable, terrifying force behind them. It certainly simplified their conflict resolution procedures.
The legacy and the unintended consequences when the consultants leave. Welcome back. We've journeyed from Genghis Khan's rather unpleasant childhood and his ingenious, albeit brutal, management techniques through his meritocratic army and terrifyingly efficient logistics and communication. Tonight, for our final chapter, we're going to explore the lasting legacy of the Mongol Empire. Because when a force conquers more land than any empire before or since, the impact isn't just felt in the immediate aftermath of a burning city or a new tax collector. It reverberates through centuries, creating both profound destruction and, ironically, unprecedented connections. What happens, in essence, when the world's most aggressive consultants finally pack up their yurts
and ride off into the historical sunset. First, let's talk about the rather surprising and often overlooked phenomenon known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. It sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? A peace enforced by the very people famous for massacring entire populations? Yet, once a territory was conquered and firmly under Mongol control, it often became remarkably safe for travel and trade. No local bandits dared to operate when they knew a Mongol patrol, notorious for their ruthless efficiency, might appear at any moment. So, for a time, the vast stretches of the Silk Road, which had been fraught with danger for centuries, became relatively secure trade arteries. Imagine for a moment a world where the only thing you had to fear was the overlord who literally destroyed your city last year. But at least your caravan wouldn't be robbed on the way to the next one. Turns out, when everyone is equally terrified of you, cross-border trade becomes remarkably efficient. This period of enforced stability facilitated an incredible, though often involuntary, cultural exchange. The Mongols weren't just conquering lands, they were inadvertently running the biggest, most aggressive talent acquisition and knowledge transfer program in history. When they sacked a city, they often spared skilled artisans, engineers, scholars, and administrators, forcibly relocating them to the Mongol capital or other newly established centers. This meant Chinese engineers were building siege engines in Persia. Persian administrators were helping govern in China, and European merchants were trading in Central Asia. Ideas, technologies, and even administrative practices moved along these newly secured routes. Gunpowder, printing, papermaking, and the compass, all Chinese innovations, spread westward with unprecedented speed, eventually playing a crucial role in Europe's own age of exploration and the scientific revolution. Of course, this exchange also facilitated the rapid spread of less desirable things, like the Black Death, which likely traveled along these very same secure trade routes. So efficiency had its downsides.
However, even the most formidable empires face the problem of succession planning. Genghis Khan built an empire bound by his personal charisma, military genius, and iron will. After his death in 1227, the empire, while initially united under his sons and grandsons, was simply too vast to remain a single entity. It fragmented into various khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Il Khanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan. These successor states, while still formidable, often squabbled amongst themselves, gradually losing the cohesive, terrifying power of the original unified empire. Even the best management consultants can't fix a succession plan based on whoever holds the biggest army and doesn't get poisoned by their cousin gets to be Khan. The internal conflicts and eventual decline of Mongol power opened up new opportunities for resistance and the rise of new local powers. The long-term impact on global history is immense. The Mongol invasions irrevocably altered the political and demographic landscapes of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Russia, for centuries under the Tartar yoke of the Golden Horde, developed a unique political identity. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate by the Ilkhanate fundamentally reshaped the Islamic world. And in Europe, the Mongol threat, while never fully materializing as a permanent conquest, spurred a sense of urgency and development. When the overland trade routes of the Pax Mongolica eventually declined, Europeans, now exposed to the wonders of the East, were incentivized to find new maritime routes, indirectly kickstarting the age of exploration. The Mongols, in their quest for domination, inadvertently laid some of the groundwork for the very interconnected world we live in today. Genghis Khan's legacy is therefore complex and deeply contradictory. He was a ruthless conqueror responsible for unimaginable destruction and loss of life. Yet his empire, forged in blood and iron, fostered an era of unprecedented trade, technological diffusion, and cultural exchange. His methods, though brutal, demonstrated a revolutionary approach to leadership, military organization, and statecraft. He proved that a meritocratic system combined with unflinching discipline and strategic pragmatism could overcome even the most entrenched aristocratic societies. His consulting advice would be cut out the dead weight, enforce absolute loyalty, be terrifyingly efficient, and for God's sake, bring enough horses. And perhaps don't leave any witnesses. So, the next time you reflect on history, remember Genghis Khan, the unconventional CEO who built the ultimate global enterprise. He showed the world that even from the harsh, unforgiving steps, a vision, however brutal, combined with relentless execution, could transform the world. His empire might have eventually crumbled, but its echoes of efficiency, terror, and unintended global connection still resonate, reminding us that sometimes the most boring parts of history, like logistics and administration, can have the most dramatic and terrifying consequences. And with that, perhaps you can finally find some peace as the vast, silent steppe settles into the quiet of the night.
The soft skills of conquest: charm, deception, and selective memory. Welcome back. We've journeyed through the harsh realities of Mongol military might, their brutal efficiency, and the surprising logistical prowess that allowed them to conquer half the known world. Tonight, we're going to peel back another layer of the Mongol success story and explore what we might, rather loosely, call their soft skills. Because while a strong army and efficient logistics are vital, true domination often comes down to mastering the subtle arts of human interaction, namely charm, strategic deception, and a highly selective memory when it came to promises. Let's begin with charm, a word rarely associated with a man who built mountains of skulls. Yet Genghis Khan, or rather the Mongol diplomatic strategy, possessed a peculiar form of allure. It wasn't the kind of charm that involved witty banter or expensive gifts, unless those gifts were a large army and the promise of not being immediately annihilated. Their charm offensive typically involved an initial, somewhat polite offer of submission. "Hello, glorious ruler. Your kingdom is beautiful. Would you care to surrender peacefully and pay us tribute? It would save us all so much trouble and burning." This was their version of a friendly handshake, albeit one where the other hand was already reaching for a torch. This offer, delivered by envoys who themselves were terrifyingly confident, was designed to exploit pre-existing fears and divisions. The Mongols rarely attacked a completely united front. They were masters of intelligence, knowing which lords hated their king, which cities had weak defenses, and which garrisons were poorly supplied. Their charm was, in essence, a hyper-efficient sales pitch for submission, backed by the undeniable threat of overwhelming force. "We're going to win anyway," their envoys subtly implied, "so why not make it easy on yourselves, and your family, and your entire city's infrastructure?" This persuasive technique often worked wonders, as many cities faced with such a stark choice opted for the pragmatic route of saving their skins, even if it meant losing their sovereignty. It was the ultimate fear of missing out. on not being massacred. Then there's deception, a soft skill the Mongols employed with the precision of a surgeon and the subtlety of a charging cavalry unit. Feigned retreats were their signature move, a tactic they refined to an art form. Imagine a vast Mongol force seemingly panicking and fleeing in disarray. Your European general, seeing this, pumps his fist, shouts victory, charge, and sends his heavily armored, slow-moving knights thundering after them. Little does he know, those fleeing Mongols are expertly luring his forces into a prearranged ambush, often a horseshoe formation, designed to encircle and annihilate. It was the ultimate bait and switch, except the bait was a false promise of victory, and the switch was a hail of arrows from all directions.
This deception wasn't limited to the battlefield. They used disinformation to sow panic and confusion. Spies and agents would spread rumors of impossibly vast Mongol armies, of invincible warriors, of divine favor. They would even use captured prisoners to spread these tales, knowing that a terrified survivor's account would be far more convincing than any official communique. Imagine getting a frantic text from a friend saying, "Dude, the Mongols are literally invincible, and they have like 1,000,000 horses." You'd probably start digging a very deep hole in your backyard. This psychological manipulation amplified their military might, making every rumor of their approach a weapon in itself. Their PR department was small, but exceptionally effective, and its primary output was terror. Perhaps the most potent soft skill was selective memory. The Mongols were very good at remembering who resisted them, and very good at forgetting promises they had made once a territory was secured. Treaties were often viewed as temporary conveniences, to be adhered to only as long as they served Mongol interests. If a vassal state became too wealthy, too independent, or simply looked like it might have a few extra sheep they hadn't reported, the Mongols' memory of their friendship would suddenly become very hazy. Oh, that treaty? Did we sign that? Perhaps it was a different Mongol. Anyway, about those sheep. This wasn't outright perfidy in their eyes. It was pragmatism. In a world of constant struggle, promises were less about moral obligation and more about strategic advantage. It taught newly conquered peoples a harsh lesson. Trust only the current state of affairs, and always expect the worst. This made long-term strategic alliances with the Mongols precarious for external powers, but it ensured that internal vassals remained in a perpetual state of wary obedience. You never knew when the Khan might remember a forgotten debt or simply decide you had too many nice things. Furthermore, their cultural exchange wasn't always a two-way street of polite sharing. While they did adopt useful innovations in skilled individuals, it was often a top-down, non-negotiable process. They weren't asking, they were taking. We appreciate your advanced engineering knowledge. Please bring it to our capital. You are not allowed to say no. Also, your entire family now lives there too. It's for better synergy. This selective integration meant that while many ideas flowed, the Mongols largely maintained their own nomadic culture,
adapting elements that served their imperial ambitions without fundamentally changing who they were. They were the ultimate disruptors, tearing down existing structures, but often only to rebuild them in a way that directly benefited their own power. So, while we often picture Genghis Khan as a brute force conqueror, his empire's success was also built on a chilling mastery of soft skills. His envoys subtly charmed their way to submission, his armies masterfully deceived their enemies, and his administration conveniently forgot inconvenient promises. These were not the gentle, empathetic skills taught in modern business schools, but in the ruthless, high-stakes game of 13th century conquest, they proved to be just as effective as a well-aimed arrow or a thundering cavalry charge. They remind us that charm can sometimes wear a very, very heavy armor, and that memory, when wielded by an empire, can be a weapon sharper than any blade. And with that, perhaps your mind can finally find a moment of peace, far from the subtle manipulations of ancient conquerors.
For the Mongols, leisure was a fleeting and often functional concept. Hunting was both a sport and a vital source of food, honing their equestrian and archery skills. Feasts, when they happened, were less about relaxation and more about communal bonding, strategic planning, and consuming enough calories to fuel the next wave of conquest. Even their famous wrestling and horsemanship games were rigorous training exercises in disguise. There was no Netflix and chill on the steppe. Entertainment involved demonstrating martial prowess or listening to epic sagas of previous conquests, which probably just reinforced the idea that you should conquer more. The benefits package was also rather unique. There was no health insurance, though being a skilled warrior probably meant you were healthier than the average European peasant. Retirement plans? Unlikely, unless you count settling down on a newly conquered plot of land, which was still work. The ultimate benefit was simple: survival and the chance to accumulate wealth through plunder. For many, this was a massive upgrade from their pre-Genghis Khan lives of endless tribal warfare and constant starvation. They traded one form of suffering for another, more organized and arguably more rewarding form of suffering. Consider the notion of performance reviews. For a Mongol warrior, every single day was a performance review. Did you obey orders? Did you fight bravely? Did you contribute to the collective success? Failure in any of these areas didn't lead to a written warning. It led to an unfortunate re-evaluation of your existence, often with fatal results. This constant pressure meant that everyone was always on, always performing at their peak. It was the ultimate high-pressure sales environment, where the product was conquest, and the penalty for not hitting your targets was, well, everything. The modern concept of boundaries between professional and personal life would have been utterly baffling to a Mongol. Your loyalties were to your unit, your commander, and ultimately to the Khan. Your personal desires, your individual comfort, your me time, these were secondary, if they existed at all. The entire society was structured around the relentless pursuit of expansion and domination. It was a corporate culture that permeated every aspect of existence, from the way you ate to the way you fought. So the next time your boss asks you to work late or you feel overwhelmed by your to-do list, spare a thought for the Mongol warriors. Their work-life balance was less a balance and more a complete absorption of life into work. They perfected the art of living a life entirely dedicated to a single, ambitious goal: universal conquest. It certainly put an end to petty office dramas, though it replaced them with slightly larger, more global, and infinitely bloodier ones. It reminds us that while we might strive for work-life balance, Some historical figures achieved greatness by simply eliminating the life part as a separate entity. And with that thought, perhaps you can truly relax, knowing your greatest challenge tonight is simply drifting off to sleep.
Work-life balance on the steppe, or why there were no yoga retreats in 13th century Mongolia. Welcome back, weary listener. We've dissected Genghis Khan's rather aggressive business acumen, from his cutthroat HR policies to his charmingly deceptive communication strategies. Tonight, for our final plus chapter, we're going to explore a topic that probably never crossed the mind of a 13th century Mongol warrior, yet is absolutely central to modern life: work-life balance. Because in an empire built on endless conquest, the line between work and life was less a blurry boundary and more a non-existent concept. And spoiler alert, there were no yoga retreats on the steppes of Mongolia. Let's begin with work, which for a Mongol wasn't a 9-to-5 affair. It was a 24/7 commitment dictated by the relentless demands of survival and conquest. Every day was a work day, whether you were moving camp, tending to livestock, training with your horse, or, most frequently, riding for days on end to sack a new city. There were no weekends, no public holidays, and certainly no mental health days. Your mental health was directly tied to your ability to avoid being killed by a rival tribe or starved by winter. The only vacation you might get was a brief pause after a particularly successful raid, which usually involved consuming large quantities of fermented mare's milk and planning the next work trip. The concept of life for a Mongol warrior was inextricably tied to this constant work. Your family, your home, a portable yurt, and your entire existence were part of the military machine. Wives and children often traveled with the army, managing the livestock, preparing food, and providing logistical support. This wasn't just a family-friendly company, it was a company is your family and your life model. There were no separate spheres. Your work was your life, and your life was your work, all under the looming shadow of the Khan's unyielding expectations. Imagine your company picnic involving a strategic ambush on the neighboring department. This complete integration of work and life meant that burnout was likely not a clinical diagnosis, but simply a state of being quickly followed by death. There were no stress management workshops, no team-building exercises involving trust falls, unless it was falling onto an enemy with a sword. High stakes, low therapy options.